Justin Lessor is a postdoctoral associate at the University of Vermont. He completed his PhD in the summer of 2021 with Dr. Jimmy Nelson at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. He was a student on the Plum Island Ecosystems Long-Term Ecological Research Site. Previously, Dr. Lessor used stable isotope analysis and field studies to understand how landscape features influence the ability of mobile consumers to connect disparate salt marsh food webs. And he developed novel isotope analysis techniques to quantify multidimensional trophic niches of consumers. For his postdoc research at UVM, Justin is helping to develop a food web model of Lake Champlain to better understand the impact different ecological events have had on the lake's food web, as well as to predict what we might see in the future. Thank you, Justin, for being with us today. We're eager to learn more about your research on food webs in Lake Champlain.
Sorry, just trying to figure out how to unmute. All right, there we go. And share. All right. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm excited to share some of my what I've been working on the past year I've been here as a postdoc. Yeah, looking at some of the impacts that some invasions might have had on the food web historically. So I wanted to start with kind of getting at the difference between people might have seen like a non-native versus an exotic versus an invasive, and kind of the working definition that I'm going with is that you have your non-natives that are introduced to a habitat outside of their original one, their native one, and then a subset of that are invasive, where they actually have a negative impact on the system. So they're kind of like this, they're within the umbrella term of non-natives. You'll see that in this diagram, there is a little bit hanging off of the bigger non-native bubble here. And so those are kind of this idea of native invasives, where something might have been extirpated or removed and reintroduced to their native range and are causing detrimental effects on the ecosystems there. So something like deer that might have been completely gone, coming back, wreaking havoc on native plants and things like that. And so, as was mentioned, I came up here a year ago from doing my PhD down in Louisiana, and invasions can kind of have these interesting and sometimes kind of funny histories associated with them showing up in a system. And so I thought I'd start off sharing some examples of that from where I came from. These guys are called nutria. They're kind of these beaver-looking kind of swamp rat guys. They're native to South America, and they were introduced to Louisiana for their fur, but they are out there and just eat tons and tons of marsh, which is not great for an area that is losing by some estimates, a football field's worth of land every hour to sea level rise, which is a real statistic, by the way. And so they were, introduced for their fur. And so you can see this lady here wearing a nutria fur collar and hat. And so this guy, this name would be very familiar to anyone where I was living for my PhD, Edmund McElhenney, but he was actually, his family actually owns Tabasco. And so he was one of the Tabasco McElhenneys, and he was kind of a naturalist, and he didn't bring them to Louisiana, but he actually brought them from New Orleans to Avery Island, where him and his family lived. And he's known to have released some of them into the marshes around there. So he might not be responsible for their introduction to the area down there, but he might be responsible for their actual introduction to the marshes and stuff. And it's a pretty interesting family. He was a naturalist. It's a very interesting family that still owns Tabasco to this day. So the owners of Tabasco may have been responsible for nutria in Louisiana. And then one more. So these are water hyacinth. These kind of pretty flowers here. They were brought to southern Louisiana, New Orleans for water gardens, but they get out and they kind of thrive in bayous and stuff down there, and they make these big mats that smother native plants and kind of choke out fish. And a little historical interesting tidbit is that as a potential control, there was an act introduced in Congress in the early 1900s to kind of get at this problem that would provision money to bring in hippos and release them into the bayous to control water hyacinth. So this guy, Robert Broussard, proposed the American Hippo Act, which would have federally set aside some money to buy hippos and release them in Louisiana bayous. And the idea was that they would not only eat the water hyacinth, but that they would be able to be hunted because there was a beef shortage in that time. And the local legend is that it didn't pass by a single vote. So we were one vote away from having hippos kind of run wild in Louisiana bayous. Pretty cool stuff. So now, as far as Lake Champlain, there are a lot of non-native species found in Lake Champlain, including a few that I didn't realize were non-native here, bass and crappie. They kind of span the gamut as far as different taxa, from fish to crustaceans, mollusks, everything. But then as far as actual things that are invasive, that number kind of gets winnowed down. And even some of these that I've highlighted here might would kind of go back and forth as to whether they're actually invasive, whether they actually have an effect. And so the one that I'm going to talk about here that we're not quite sure of yet is alewife. So that's these guys up here. So what is an alewife? Well, so alewife are typically anadromous fish, meaning they live in the ocean, and they usually come into freshwater to spawn and then go back out. The ones in Lake Champlain and in lots of lakes around are landlocked, so they remain in freshwater their entire lives, and they don't need to return to the ocean. And so they're zooplanktivorous. So these aren't alewife down here. These are similar species, menhaden, and you can see them kind of swimming along, eating the zooplankton off the bottom, kind of with that filter feeding mouth. And it's kind of a similar situation with alewives. And so as far as like where they fit into the kind of the lake food web, there are kind of these prey fish conspecifics with rainbow smelt, which are also invasive and also native in depending on which lake you're talking about. And so they consume a lot of the zooplankton. They do consume some mysis, maybe rainbow smelt consume a little bit more, but they're kind of these conspecifics with, these guys, this rainbow smelt here. They're both big prey fish for a lot of species that people might be interested in. So things like lake trout and salmon, to a much lesser extent salmon. So salmon rely on other parts of the food web and other kind of, it's like sources of food. And that's going to be important in a little bit when I get to some results. And of course, all of these guys exist within the larger Lake Champlain food web. I don't have time to kind of get into all these different connections, but these are all different kinds of predators and maybe also some prey fish. But yeah, so that's kind of like where they exist in the lake writ large food web. Right, so they've invaded a lot of the Great Lakes throughout history. So all the way back in the 1800s, they started showing up in Lake Ontario, and then through Erie, Huron, Michigan, through the 50s. And we know that they're associated with declines or at least preventing the recovery of a few other species, as you can see here on this gradient here, things like lake trout, Atlantic salmon, like I just talked about in the food web. So them showing up here was kind of a little bit scary of an effect because we know how they kind of have affected things in other places. Right. So then in 2003, 50 years after in the Great Lakes, they started showing up in Lake Champlain. They increased numbers through 2007, where there was a huge rapid expansion. There's a pretty big die-off in the south part of the lake the next year, but they're kind of a known presence. They're here since then. So much more recent of an invasion than in the Great Lakes. And so the question that I've been trying to answer and that a lot of people want to know is what impact they have on the food webs of Lake Champlain, right? We have this information of how they impacted the Great Lakes. How exactly did they do it here? Is it the same? Is it different? And so this question kind of seems simple, but when you actually start to like think about a food web and try to answer this question, it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. So here we can see quickly when you start to draw all the connections between things and add things in, food webs get really, really complicated really quickly. When you're all the different things that different species eat, things that eat them all together at once, it gets very complex. And so when we're talking about something coming in, right, we're not necessarily going to see impacts that we necessarily expect. This thing might impact, the species here, and then this might radiate down here, which has different effects radiating up, and so on and so forth. So it's a pretty complicated task to really predict how a species is going to impact a whole food web at once. So, right, so if we start to draw in the arrows in the food web that I mentioned before, right, you can see how quickly it starts to get very complicated and yeah, right. So then the other thing is that when we're talking about a whole food web, it's easy to kind of draw and hypothesize about, what the food web looks like, but as far as going out and measuring a whole food web, it's kind of a question of what are you even looking at, right? So if you look here at this complex drawing, we can look at the sizes of all these different nodes. As far as an impact, we can talk about the numbers of connections or the types of connections, so that we need to bound kind of what we're looking at in terms of like the whole food web. So for my postdoc, we chose to use this Ecopath with Ecosim. That's what EWE up here stands for. And so this is a good model because it kind of it kind of incorporates all the information that all these different kind of smaller research studies or models can give us information on, and it gives us some kind of information about what's going on in the whole food web at once. And so it gives us this distribution of biomass in the system, and it has these two parts, Ecopath with Ecosim, right? Those are the two parts. So the Ecopath part is a static kind of mass balance snapshot of the system. So what lives there, what interactions do we know exist in this one point in time? And then Ecosim is the simulation part. So how does that change with some factor between some point A that we define and some point B? And so I kind of bore everyone with the equations and describe all the parameters and everything, but the idea is that we need data, right? So we have some long-term studies that give us data, and that we need that to incorporate that to understand what's going on in the food web. And so these are some for the Ecopath portion, the static portion where we chose 2007 after Alewife already entered the system. We get them from either known stock biomass, some estimates that we have, some papers of long-term sampling, and then diet information we can take from tons of different papers that have been published on Lake Champlain, or if there's none for Lake Champlain, other Great Lakes systems. And we incorporate that, we put it all together, and we come up with a Ecopath model. For ours, we focused on this main lake portion of Lake Champlain. So yeah, we kind of just focused on this one ecoregion here, where we took as much data as we could from specifically, yeah. So after all of that information is kind of added into the model, it gets balanced, which is kind of bumping up numbers here and there to kind of make sure it all makes sense. So it's kind of like a big juggling balancing act to kind of get some input that the model can accept. And then we use the Ecosim portion of the program to simulate the change over time. So that's where we add in the actual Alewife invasion, and we do that with modulating this friction pressure, so they kind of disappear at the first model step, and then around 2003 through 2007, we can slowly kind of release them to their their levels that we know now, right? So that simulates them not being in the system, then slowly entering the system. And then we can also modulate the strength of predator-prey, their predator-prey interactions, right? With this vulnerability parameter, where we have Alewife to their prey, right? So there's no impact up until 2003 when they first show up in the system. And then starting then, they're eating, just like they normally would. Here is an example of a predator impact on Alewife, where again, no impact up until they invade in 2003. And then right around 2005, right, we know that Alewife really took off in 2007, but we're assuming that predators quickly figure out that Alewifes are really good to eat. And so that modulates that interaction that way. So we do all that, we get all that information, and we get an output that looks like this. very confusing, very kind of all complicated all at once, as I said. And so what I'm going to do for the next part of my talk is kind of pull out those 4 species that I mentioned at the beginning: alewives, of course, smelt, lake trout, and Atlantic salmon, and kind of show you what the model predicts happens specifically for them. So, right, so we're going to start with alewives here and rainbow smelt, where we have actually biomass estimates over time from trawling data that we can compare the model result to see what how the predictions match up to real biomass, how the model's predictions of biomass match up to real biomass estimates. And so that's what we have here. So here we have over time 95, 95 through 2020. These lines are our model's output prediction. And then these dots represent actual years of trawling data that we can compare it to. So here, this red line, we have alewives coming in, right? They're not in the system yet. 2003, they start to slowly come into the system. They take off by 2007. That's what this bounding box, or this gray box, is the period of invasion here. And yeah, and then they're off and in the system after that. And so when we look at our smelt, we actually, even though these are kind of conspecific, potentially competitive zooplanktivorous fish, we actually really don't see them affect each other that much. I mean, they're kind of flat before, hanging out kind of here before the alewife enter the system. Afterwards, we see a slight dip, but not really that much impact. And you know, from here, comparing this result to these actual data points, it might not look like a very good fit, but really the smelt data seems to be impacted more by yearly variability. So there could be, you know, some other factors that are controlling smelt populations, maybe environmental, maybe other things that really aren't explained by our model. But yeah, but this kind of result aligns with some other studies from the system where it actually seems like alewife coming in don't really have much of an effect on smelt populations in terms of biomass dynamics. So yeah, so like I said, we don't see any evidence of competitive exclusion that tracks with other papers, and this is actually in line with the effects that we know occurred in the Great Lakes. Right, here's that gradient of alewife effects. Right, rainbow smelt are kind of in this minimal effect window where they actually don't see, even though you might expect them to compete for the same resources, they actually don't seem to really be affected as much as we think. But that's not to say that there aren't some effects that we see, right? So we do see evidence of spatial segregation in the main lake, where smelt are actually forced a little lower because alewife kind of come in and dominate the upper regions of the lake. Smelt kind of get forced into more deeper areas. And in kind of those other regions of the lake where they're shallower, where they don't have that deep region that they can kind of adapt to, there is kind of evidence of some kind of biomass effect. And then there are also other food web differences in those regions, right? The presence of mysis versus arthropods in other regions, right? So there are some potential effects in other places, but specifically in the main lake, they seem to have kind of solved this problem of competitive exclusion, maybe with this spatial segregation. So now let's move on to the 2 predators, right? We have lake trout. Here we don't have a good, real actual, you know, stock assessment data, but we have a population model that we're going to compare it to. So just kind of based on age of catch and Atlantic salmon, right? Another predator of interest to everyone. So we'll start with this green line. So this is salmon, is this green line. I have them both on the same figure. And again, our dots are going to be for lake trout, our population model. Our lines are the model's prediction, and kind of we see an increase right in the period right after alewife enter the system, but really overall we don't really see that much impact on their biomass. And again, that makes sense because we know that they get a lot of their food from other diet items, right? Either outside the main lake food web, in other parts of the lake, or other portions of our model that aren't as affected by alewife. So overall, the impact of alewife on Atlantic salmon really isn't that great. But now if we switch to the purple line here, we see that as alewife enter the system in this gray box here, we see a really pronounced impact on lake trout, which consume alewife. Alewife make up a very, very large portion of their diet here, right? So, and this is actually a pretty good fit with what we estimate from our population model. We see that right around this period, we see a really big increase potentially in their population. Yeah, so it seems that alewife kind of have made the system support more lake trout biomass as compared to Atlantic salmon biomass. So yeah, so to sum up those impacts, right, we really don't see any much impact except for maybe in that period right after on Atlantic salmon. And again, we know this is probably because they rely on other parts of the food web. But yeah, this is pretty opposite of what was seen in the Great Lakes. They're in this strongest effect kind of area over here. But it seems that like in Lake Champlain, they really had kind of the opposite, or not really the opposite, but kind of no effect, different than what we saw in the Great Lakes. And then again, with lake trout, we see a really strong positive impact where their numbers really increase, seem to increase after alewife invasion. And yeah, that truly is really opposite of their impact, where they were kind of associated with declines and the prevention of recovery. But there are some differences between those Great Lakes areas and in our lake here, Lake Champlain. So in the Great Lakes, a lot of that effect is thought to come from alewife consuming larvae of these species, but we actually don't see a lot of that in Lake Champlain. We know that doesn't really, we don't see tons of it. There's also some evidence of thiamine limitation, limiting like healthy egg production, but it doesn't really seem to have this, again, doesn't really seem to be as much of a problem in Lake Champlain with egg success. And then another thing to consider is that kind of the context of the invasion themselves were very different, right? So alewife entered Lake Champlain after predator stalking was already in full force, and this not after predator stalking was successful, which was only happened recently, but after there were already these large populations of these predatory species. So it's possible that they were simply like incorporated differently into the food web because there's kind of this different order of things happening, where they're there, they can kind of manage how they entered the system differently. So yeah, so as far as whether alewife we see any actual invasive effects in Lake Champlain, it seems like based on our model, and again, this is just a model, it's just a kind of a prediction, but based on that, we see at worst, no impact really on biomass of species we might be specifically interested in here, to kind of this positive impact on lake trout biomass. But it's also important to note, if we go back to our complex food web from the beginning of the talk here, that we're just looking at one specific aspect of this food web here with this model, right? So we're just kind of looking at how does alewife come in and change the sizes of these different points. But like I said at the beginning, you could also look at the number, the types of connections, what's connected where. So there's the potential for other food web effects. And so I'm going to show a few kind of preliminary things, some of which come from the model, some of which come from some preliminary stable isotope analysis that I've helped out with, that kind of shows that, even if we see these no or positive biomass effects, that there still might be some changes to the food web itself. So this is the percent diet output that we get from the model for lake trout, right? So again, here is over time. And then this actually should be proportion of lake trout diet, not percent. So this would be 20%, not 0.2%. And we can see how the model predicts that lake trout diet would have changed over time during the period of before and after alewife invasion, right? So before, they kind of go from eating about 60% rainbow smelt, which if we think about where rainbow smelt are getting their energy from, right? They're zooplanktivores, so they're getting their energy from this pelagic section of the lake. And so they're relying on about 60% pelagic sourced energy, where if we look after, right, now because of the addition of alewife, now they're getting a lot more of their energy from pelagic, quote unquote, sources. And that comes kind of at the expense of this other category, which is a composite of a lot of different other nodes in that big food web that could be sourced in other places, right? So now they've traded kind of some of that other maybe external production for more for using more of the pelagic production in the food web. So that's one potential food web change that could explain this increase in biomass. Additionally, and this is data from preliminary stable isotope analysis. So these are mixing model results from preliminary stable isotope analysis, where we actually see that alewife seem to derive more of their own biomass from sources from this hypolimnetic deep layer of phytoplankton. So whereas rainbow smelt kind of get more of their biomass from detritus. So another potential food web impact might be that alewives have kind of exposed lake trout to a completely new pathway for energy from the sun to enter their biomass, right? Giving them access to this hypolimnetic, this deep phytoplankton layer at the expense of this detrital energy pathway. So another potential food web impact that isn't necessarily biomass related. And then lastly, we actually find that alewives have a little bit lower of a trophic level than rainbow smelt. And that makes sense if we boil that whole food web down to kind of this kind of food chain thing. We can see that alewives represent a whole kind of trophic transfer step, one less trophic transfer step between primary production down here, right? Primary production to zooplankton, alewife to lake trout, as opposed to primary production to zooplankton that get eaten by mysis, right? Rainbow smelt eat a lot more mysis than alewife. So that represents a whole nother trophic step. And kind of a rule of thumb in food webs is that 10% of energy moves from trophic level to trophic level. So 10% of the energy found here would make it here, and so on and so forth. And with that whole being at a lower trophic level, that means that alewife could be exposing lake trout to more of that that energy available at that primary production level by a good amount. And so that could also explain that change in biomass that we see for them. But these are all like potential future areas that we're looking at. We also hope to use the model to look at the impact of wild lake trout establishment. So recently we've actually been seeing wild lake trout that were born in the lake that weren't stocked, and we want to know kind of what their impact on the food web might have been and might still be. So that's kind of an in the works portion of the model, getting that set up. And then pretty interestingly, we have these imminent invasions by a few other species like round goby and quagga mussel that we want to kind of get ahead of and predict what their impacts might be on the food web using this biomass model. And so that's another area of study that's kind of in the works that I hope to maybe share some results on next set of talks, who knows. But that's all I've got. So with that, I will take any questions that anyone might have that I see there are some in the chat and Q&A. So yeah, hope you enjoyed my talk, and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Justin.